Welcome back. You're watching SA Today on the SABC News channel, which is always independent and impartial. Now, today, the African Christian Democratic Party marched to the United Nations building, and its leader, Reverend Kenneth Meshoe, joins me now in studio to talk about a march to local citizens at the UN offices to hand over a memorandum to demand that the UN intervene and stop the killing of Zimbabweans by their own soldiers. Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, so a lot of people will say the issues in Zimbabwe have been going on for decades. Why is your party only responding to some of the cries of Zimbabweans today?
You know, pictures speak louder than words. We have been hearing what was happening, but not seeing the visuals. But this time we've been bombarded with visuals of what is happening in Zimbabwe, and also understanding that it is unfair for petrol to be increased by more than double overnight. And so people don't have food, people don't have transport because there's no petrol. So one understands why people go into the streets to protest, because that is not the reason why they vote for government. When people vote for a government, they are hoping that that government is going to make things easier for them. It will ensure that they have security. It will ensure that there is petrol, or those who want to have food, they can go to the stores and they find food. But unfortunately, there is no food, there is no petrol, and it's only suffering. And when people want to express themselves, they are beaten brutally by the soldiers and the police, and we believe that this is unacceptable.
We'll come back to that just now, because there's quite a number of issues there. But why the UN and not the Zimbabwean embassy?
You know, the UN has authority. The UN can stand up and say, this is wrong, we are not going to allow this, and they can intervene. Now, we remembered what happened in Rwanda, when the UN was informed that there are going to be killings, there's going to be genocide, and people were saying, please do something. And the UN decided to do nothing. And as a result, more than between 800 and 1 million people lost their lives. Now, we do not want to see the same thing happen in Zimbabwe. Obviously, going to an embassy, the ambassador is not going to do anything except to inform his own government in Zimbabwe that there are people who are complaining. So they cannot intervene. The ambassador cannot intervene. The person, an organization that can intervene is the United Nations, because they have the authority, also the legitimacy of doing so.
So what did you ask of the UN specifically?
We said we give them 14 working days to ensure that the brutality and atrocities we hear about in Zimbabwe are brought to an end by them intervening in Zimbabwe to stop what is happening, because if it's left unchecked, the situation will become worse, and we might end up having a civil war that might end up also in another genocide. And because we love peace, and Zimbabweans, we know them to be people of peace. We want the peace we're enjoying in South Africa to be enjoyed also by the Zimbabweans. Also knowing that if there is a major crisis there, millions of them will pour into South Africa. That is going to put pressure on social services. And as a result, South Africans also are going to protest and say, we demand service delivery. So we are going to be affected by what's happening in Zimbabwe. That is why we want to see a situation and a solution before we are negatively impacted by what's happening in Zimbabwe.
What can they do? There's a democratically elected government in power. The president there has said that I want to call a national dialogue. He's going to investigate these atrocities. He's saying all the right things.
He's saying the right things but doing the wrong things. Okay? One of the wrong things that we have been told the president did was that after they removed the former president Mugabe, there was an agreement between ZANU-PF, the current president, and also the opposition, that there be a government of national unity for 5 years while the country is stabilized. And after the 5 years, then they will have fresh elections. So the president somehow, I don't know why he changed his mind. He changed his mind. Now, we all believe that had he agreed to that, the opposition would have also said to the international community, the sanctions that we requested, we demanded, we can lift them up now, because we are working together as a nation. We want to build our nation. Now, today we are hearing is the government and also our own president, Ramaphosa, who says the sanctions must be lifted. Now, I don't know whether he's just playing politics or he thinks that can happen. Remember that in South Africa, when there were sanctions against the then apartheid government, those sanctions were called by the opposition, the ANC, and other political formations. So the international community lifted those sanctions, not after the demand or request was made by the same government. It was not the National Party government that lifted the sanctions, but the request came from the oppressed. Yeah. So in Zimbabwe, the same thing. If members of the opposition do not request for the sanctions to be lifted, they will not be lifted.
So do you not believe or take him at his word? He did set up an inquiry after the August 1 shootings in the country. He says now that any excessive force by security forces will be investigated. You don't believe him?
Well, I don't believe him in the sense that he has reneged on the agreement he has made. And people are going to hold him at his word. Why should they believe him now when he agreed to have a government of national unity in the interest of Zimbabweans? Now he has changed his mind. So what would make us to believe in this time?
From your understanding, is the force that the security forces have been deploying still in operation now? Are people still being visited by security forces in the night and being beaten, as was being reported?
From what I heard this morning, I haven't seen the news this afternoon, but this morning that was still the case. That is why we feel that we have to make noise. That if the UN does not give us the assurance that they are doing something about it, they are sending troops in there, they are ensuring that people are allowed to demonstrate peacefully, then we are going to get bigger numbers to go into the streets. Today we did not have a big crowd. Why? Because the idea just dropped in my heart on Sunday. So on Sunday I said, even though there is no time, let's do something, because some people are saying, let's try next week. I said, but people might again. How many people will die this week?
So you're going to march in South Africa for the UN to do something in Zimbabwe?
Correct. Because if the Zimbabweans march, they're beaten by the police. They are stopped for marches. So we are going to get more Zimbabweans that are in South Africa into the streets and say, because in Zimbabwe, they will not listen to you, but in South Africa, you have the right to march peacefully, so let your voices be heard, even to the United Nations.
But you know the United Nations is almost unlikely to deploy troops into Zimbabwe. There isn't a war situation, in their view, in that country. So another plan is going to need to happen.
Exactly what they did in Rwanda. Now we are saying to the United Nations, we don't want a repeat of Rwanda. When you were told that people are going to lose their lives by the hundreds of thousands, you did nothing. So this time, act and show that Zimbabwe does not become another Rwanda.
Reverend Meshoe, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks very much indeed for joining us. And perhaps we can invite you again in a short while to talk about your party and your manifesto.
It will be great. It will be great.
Thanks so much for your time. I look forward to that as well.
Thank you very much for having me.